Okay, thank you all for coming and welcome to this policy and practice seminar hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and School of Public Policy. My name's Fergus Green. I'm a lecturer in the department. I convene the policy and practice series and I co-lead our department's climate politics research cluster, and I'll be your chair for this evening. So the title of today's seminar is Where Next for Net Zero UK Climate Policy at a Crossroads. Now, net zero, of course, refers to the UK's legislated target of reducing its domestic greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. And we'll hear from our expert panel this evening about the changes to infrastructure, technology, and behaviour that are needed to achieve this target, and about the policies that are needed to drive those changes throughout the economy and society of the UK. Now, one reason we might think that Britain is at a crossroads on net zero is that those policy settings currently are inadequate to drive the remaining decarbonisation that we need to get to net zero. So, arguably, we're going to need new and better policies. And yet, precisely when we need to strengthen our policy portfolio to get to net zero, we're witnessing the fraying of the UK's bipartisan, more or less, consensus around net zero. And so there's a second party political sense in which the UK is at something of a crossroads when it comes to achieving net zero. And we're potentially entering a new period of partisan contestation over the issue. So to discuss these issues and more, I'm delighted to welcome three excellent speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they will make their opening remarks. Our first speaker, Michael Jacobs, is Professor of Political Economy in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. Now, among Michael's many previous roles, he was a special advisor to Prime Minister Gordon Brown from 2007 to 2010, and I think it's fair to say played a key role in the development of the UK Climate Change Act and some of the institutional architecture that's central to the UK's net zero policy. And Michael was also heavily involved in the sort of politics and leading up to the Paris Agreement as an advisor to various governments and other organisations. Our second speaker is Juliet Sanders, and she is Director of Strategic Communications at Energy UK, the trade association for the UK energy industry. She holds Masters in Manufacturing Engineering, and I believe started her career as an energy sort of analyst, but moved fairly quickly into media and communications roles, and she spent where she spent much of the last decade at various organisations, including EDF, Ørsted and Equinor, before moving to Energy UK. And Juliet is passionate about inspiring and developing others in the energy sector and is a founding member of the TIDE task force, set to improve equity, diversity and inclusion in the energy industry. And our third speaker, let me turn my page, is Sean Spears. And Sean is Executive Director of the think tank Green Alliance, which works to build ambitious leadership on environmental issues in the UK, across the political spectrum, and in the business and NGO communities. Previously, Sean was Director of CPRE, the Countryside charity, for 13 years, and he was also a member of the European Parliament from 1994 to 1999 and served on the Parliament's Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee. And he's the author of the book How to Build Houses and Save the Countryside, published
1 or 2 copies left.
Published in 2018. So each speaker will give opening remarks of about 5 to 7 minutes. Then we'll have a panel discussion, and finally we'll open it up to audience questions. Before handing over to the first speaker, let me remind you that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded, and this will be available on our department's website, the YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. So if you do speak, you will be heard in the recording, and if you don't speak, you won't. We'll let you know when the recording is available, and we hope that you might want to share it with others. Okay, without further ado, let me hand over to our first speaker, Michael Jacobs.
Thank you very much indeed, Fergus, and thank you all for coming. So I've been asked to just kind of set a bit of context for the UK net zero strategy and position, and particularly the scientific and international context. So let me first give you the good news. It's worth starting with good news because the rest of it won't be. The good news is that we're doing really well. Globally, we are in the midst now, at the early stages, but definitely in the midst of an energy revolution. 80% of all new investment in power generation around the world last year was in renewables, or in grids, or in demand management. 80%. Basically, renewables are now what people in the energy industry do. There is still investment in fossil fuels, as we know, but in power, it's now nearly all renewables. In vehicles, electric vehicles are very close to the point where they will be cheaper to run in densely populated countries, and the US is a slight exception to this, but in most of the world, electric vehicles are now very close to the point where over their lifetime they are cheaper than petrol and diesel vehicles, which means that policy is not as needed because the market will start taking over. And there's very, very rapid development, and China has just started marketing electric vehicles in Europe, and that's part of the reasons the costs have fallen so far. And if you look at temperature projections based on what currently the world is doing, they have fallen very dramatically. So in the run-up to the Paris Agreement in 2015, the world was headed, according to IPCC projections, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for 5 to 6 degrees of warming. As a result of the policies that governments put in place after the Paris Agreement, by 2018, that was down to 4 to 5 degrees. So this is a projection of how much warming we will get based on business as usual of what governments are doing. It's now down to 2.7 to 3 degrees of warming. Now that is an indication. Those are the projections of expected warming given what governments have put in place. That's an achievement, a huge achievement. But the problem is, and that's where I'm afraid the good news ends, 2.7 to 3 degrees of warming is absolutely disastrous, utterly disastrous for everybody. And if you think that recent weather events indicate that the climate might be changing, this is at 1.4 degrees of warming, and of course the global goal is to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees, so we're very, very close to that already. And the climate last year broke all records, hottest year on record, the highest temperatures in almost every part of the world got their record temperatures last year, and by a mile. The records were not just shaved off, this is Adam Peaty beating his own breaststroke record over 50 metres by a second. They're off the charts, last year's records, and the climate is now changing very rapidly. And unfortunately, our experience with the climate is it gets hotter and the effects get greater more than the scientists expect. The scientists always seem to err now on the so we are, although there is this extraordinary achievement, in a sense, in shifting our energy and transport systems, it isn't nearly enough. The international political context is, I think, very interesting. We have a Paris Agreement which sets in train a 5-year process under which governments need to improve their climate commitment. So every 5 years, governments collectively, all of them, and this was a great achievement in a way of the Paris Agreement, it isn't just whenever a country feels like doing it, every country has to do it on the same timescale, has to come up with a stronger climate change plan than last time. It is up to them what they do. Each country is self-determining, but it has to be stronger than last time. And we did that 2015, did it in 2020. It wasn't 2020 because the COP didn't take place that year because of the pandemic. But in 2021, Glasgow, countries came forward. The problem was they weren't strong enough. And we tried then to make them do it again in 2022 and 2023, and that basically failed. Almost no country, Australia was in fact the only country that improved its commitments. But we've got another go in 2025. That's the next 5-year moment. So in the COP30 in Belém in Brazil, running up to that, we will see a whole bunch of new climate change commitments. The problem with the Paris Agreement is that it sets a global goal, but then it allows every country to do its own thing. And you won't be surprised to learn that when you add up all the things that countries do, they don't add up to the global goal. It'd be absolutely extraordinary if they did. I mean, it'd be a coincidence, basically, because there isn't a process of trying to get the individual countries to the global goal. So there's this emissions gap, and it's that gap that means we are on course for 2.7 to 3 degrees of warming. We are not on the track that the world has said. And what worries me now about this process is we had a kind of theory of change. The Paris Agreement was very cleverly thought through. And there was a kind of theory of change, as a campaigner would say, which was that if countries are forced to act collectively every 5 years, under the pressure of meeting a global goal, they will do more than they would have done otherwise. And if you force the leaders to come to the COPs, they will be forced to take this seriously in a way that they might not otherwise do. And at those 5-year moments, you will mobilise the world's NGOs and civil society and young people to put such pressure on governments that they will do more. In fact, what we've done is we've invited the leaders every year instead of to those 5-year COPs. So they now go, and they know that they can go make an okay speech on climate and get away with it. So that bit of the theory of change is, what are we doing with leaders? Are we forcing them to address this? We've got less leverage on them. And each meeting that they go to and don't do very much and get away with it politically at home and internationally, the less pressure there is. The environmental movement is not in a great place right now. The big logo NGOs, with all due respect to some of them, are not nearly, the Greenpeace is WWF, not nearly as effective as they used to be. Greta Thunberg, tremendously effective. The Fridays for Future, for a short period. Will there be enough? So the theory of change we built around Paris, which was that this 5-year process, pressure on leaders to take this seriously when they went to COPs, in global civil society would deliver, along with the terrible warnings of climate science. And my worry is that I'm not sure whether that's going to work as well again. And that's the only theory of change we have. That's the only way we can currently see this. So I think that I'm worried about whether or not, I think that this was correct to try and do this, but I'm not sure we're there. The last thing then to say is about the UK, and this rather as Fergus says, we've lost the consensus. The Conservative Party has decided under this leadership to make green issues, climate change, a culture war issue. The salient moment was this speech 8 weeks ago, when Rishi Sunak reneged on a couple of climate policies. Actually, those things were not the most significant element. They weren't that significant. What was significant was his social media action, which were these 6 policies that he said he was scrapping. 7 recycling bins, compulsory insulation of your home, and 4 others, which were all lies. I mean, just straightforward lies. They weren't government policy, so they hadn't been scrapped. They weren't even Labour policy. One of them was a tax on meat. As Ed Miliband said, even the Vegan Society doesn't support a tax on meat. But they went straight into the social media feeds, and that's what they were for. And basically what you had was this attempt to say green policy is woke, it's metropolitan, it's elitist, it's liberal, it's all the things that you as an ordinary British person don't like and shouldn't like. And that is a very worrying moment, because that's not going to change. They're going to lose the election. It doesn't really work, this stuff, in Britain. But they won't stop after the election when they've lost the election, and they will put pressure on everything that Labour wants to do in this field on that basis. And we were one of the countries that had consensus. You looked at America, no consensus there, tremendous divisions. We're moving in that direction, and I regret that deeply.
Thank you very much, Michael. So I'll go straight over to Juliette Sanders.
Thank you. As Fergus said, I work for Energy UK, so we're the trade association that represents all of the energy sector, so we're the only one that really covers the whole thing. So we do generation, wind, solar, nuclear, all the way through to the retail side and things in between, so EV charging companies, heat pumps. So we really do have that whole sector view. And when we look at the UK, actually, the progress that we've made in decarbonising our economy is really great, as we've seen. So we've cut our emissions by half since 1990, and a large part of that has been down to the decarbonisation of the power sector. So looking at that, if we look at coal, for example, our generation has gone from around 40% in 2013 down to around 1% in 2023. Huge progress there. Gas remains the largest source in 2023 of electricity production, but it was at its lowest level since 2015. And a large part of what's been able to drive this has been a rapid growth in renewables and clean technology. And one success story, which I'm sure you're aware of, is the offshore wind sector. really where we've been able to lead the world in the deployment of offshore wind. Up until very recently, we had the most capacity deployed in the world, although China has now taken over, taken that title away from us. And really what's driven that offshore wind growth has been stable government policy and innovative government policy that's now being replicated all over the world. So the contracts for difference mechanism, which basically enabled investors to have a stable return that they could rely on, so it helps improve their business case. And that's really driven down the cost of capital for projects, which has enabled us to really roll them out much faster than we would have otherwise. And so the point behind that is that actually it was a very clever policy from government, but it was supported by successive governments as well. And that's really worked. And all of that has enabled us to decarbonise the power sector, I think by 75% since 1990. But we've been able to do a lot of that without input from the public as such. So I'm not saying that's the easy part. I've never built an offshore wind farm in my life, and I imagine it's quite hard. But actually, the public haven't really had to engage with us up until this point, and we've still managed to do all of that. So the next part of it is going to be much harder because, as I'm sure Sean will speak around, actually, when we think about decarbonising heat, when we think about decarbonising transport, that is going to rely on behavioural change, it is going to rely on disruptions in people's homes. All of that will bring great benefits for them. You know, it will mean that they can use electricity at times when it's much cheaper because there's more renewables on the system. It means they can benefit from things like the demand flexibility service, where they can shift when they use their electricity and actually get paid for that. So there'll be, and obviously energy efficiency, the more we invest in energy efficiency, the lower people's bills will be in the long run. So the next few years of policy making really are critical, and they need to be long-term. And what we've seen works is when we have these policies that are long-term aims built with long-term targets as well, so that then the market can really invest here and build up. Some of the things that we need to introduce to get to net zero are not going to be popular. So if you think about the grid, for example, we need to make sure that we have a grid that's able to cope with different forms of electricity generation that we haven't had before, so more renewables, more variable generation on the grid. And we're also going to be using more electricity as we decarbonise heat and transport as well. So National Grid estimates that in the next 7 years, we have to build 5 times as much infrastructure than we have done in the last 30 years. Which is incredible when you think about that. And it's the same with offshore wind to meet our energy security targets. We have to build 4 times as much by 2030. So there's a huge, huge job ahead of us. And people may be asking, what's in it for me? Why do you need to build all this kit all around the country? And really that's because energy does underpin absolutely everything. So from heavy industries, from data centres, actually the cost of energy and the way that we use it really does underpin our life, right through to everyday objects such as, tomatoes, which have grown 40% in cost, which have increased 40% in cost, which has largely been down to a huge cost increase in the energy production needed there. So really for us, net zero, it's not just about tackling the climate crisis. It's much bigger than that. It's the most economically sensible thing to do for our country, and it's also about making sure that people can afford to pay their energy bills. Energy is an essential service. Currently 20% of homes in the UK are living in fuel poverty, and it's not acceptable really in this state. So the more that we can invest in energy efficiency, the more that we can invest in clean forms of energy generation, the more we can protect households from future energy shocks, the more we can make sure that our businesses can compete competitively on a global scale. There's no point in, if our businesses have to pay much higher energy costs, they're not going to be able to compete with countries where their energy costs are much cheaper. And it will also have a huge impact on the public sector. So, for example, the NHS, if they can reduce their energy costs, that's going to have a benefit for us all. Schools, if we can make those more energy efficient, that's going to cut their energy bills. So really, it's a no-brainer to do. However, to reach the goals that we need to, we're going to have to invest a lot more than we are now. So most of the investment to get to net zero will come from the private sector, but we're going to need about 5 times more investment than what we've got today. And so to enable that, we need to make sure that we've got those clear signals for investors so that they know that they can invest in the UK, they know what they're going to get back, they know that there's not going to be policy that's just going to flip. And actually it was interesting, I'm sure we can come on to it a bit more, but actually exactly as you said, what Rishi Sunak announced, actually the policies, 2 or 3 of them, it's fine, we can cope with those because we have other mechanisms that will pick up the the fallout of it, but it's really the signal that it's sending to investors all over the world that the UK is no longer behind net zero, and that has a huge impact, especially as global competition is increasing. So a few things that we can do to move the needle to hit net zero. So first, it's about the grid, so making sure that we're sorting out the connection times for new projects to get connected. If we can't do that, then there's no point in building them. Sorting out planning as well for large infrastructure projects. So currently it takes around 10 years to get an offshore wind farm through the consenting process. And one project off the coast of East Anglia, their planning documentation actually was larger than the whole works of Shakespeare. I think it was 13,000 pages. Sorry, yeah. And there are lots of things that we can do. Energy efficiency, for example, we need to make sure that we're investing in that. Yes, so basically to conclude, the ambition and drive is there from the industry, but we need to act really quickly. The quicker we act, the cheaper it will be for the UK on the public purse, and we also need to make sure that we're working in partnership with government. So if government creates the right framework, then industry will be able to deliver. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. And over to you, Sean.
Great, thanks, Fergus. So I'm going to try and do two things. One is talk about the carbon gap, the gap between the policies the government has and those it needs to have in order to get on track to net zero, meeting the fifth carbon budget, which is 2028 to 2032. But policy takes some time to implement, so you've got to have the policies in place. The sooner you have them in place, the less you have to do. And a little bit also, I'm going to talk about the problem of sort of complacency and indeed a problem of confidence, because I think politicians are looking at the changes they've got to make and also reading the sort of the Daily Telegraph. Some of you might not read the Daily Telegraph, but if you did read the Daily Telegraph, you'd see a welter of articles every day saying net zero is unaffordable. Similar in the Mail, in the Sun. They're looking at what's happening in Germany, where the neo-Nazi AfD is polling in the eastern part of Germany at 30 or 35%, and tying that in with a sort of anti-net zero policies, a bit of a backlash against some policies in France, far-right populist climate skeptic party elected in the Netherlands, and so on. And I think politicians are struggling to come up with the narrative that the changes we need are actually going to be beneficial for people. They're going to make us warmer, have better lives, cleaner air, etc., etc. So some of the things, particularly the more tricky things that require behaviour change, I think politicians have got into a bit of a crouch and are not sort of willing to go out and argue the case. And that applies, I think, across party. But in terms of the carbon gap, that's existed for some time. There's a lack of detailed pathways, sort of quantified carbon reductions to meet net zero across government departments. And it got worse after Rishi Sunak's speech in September, which Michael referred to. And I think the complacency is also exemplified really by Rishi Sunak's tone since he became Prime Minister, in stark contrast to Boris Johnson, sometimes sort of evangelical zeal on achieving net zero. So in his speech to COP in December, the Prime Minister said, "Let's be very clear, the UK is leading the charge. We're absolutely committed to our net zero targets. We've already decarbonised faster than any other major economy. Our emissions are down 48% since 1990, mostly because of the power sector." And then he's talked about compared to limited cuts from others. So this is the UK is leading, we're world leading, etc., but there's not a real attention to the policy changes that are needed across different departments. And indeed, the Prime Minister keeps saying he wants a more pragmatic, proportionate and realistic approach that eases the burdens on families, rather than listening to the advice from the Climate Change Committee that sets out very clear pathways of what needs to be done to meet the net zero targets. So Green Alliance, my organisation, since March 2020 has produced regular updates of a net zero policy tracker, looking across different departments at what's promised and what needs to be done. The last one we did was in June. It said that there was policy or policies under consultation or policy ambition, which could just be a speech or an aspiration in a government paper, to reach 85% of the greenhouse gas emissions needed during the fifth carbon budget period. But only 35% was in law, 29% was under consultation, 21% was policy ambition, and there was a 15% gap with no policy at all. And we go through that department by department. I'm not going to go through it, but I mean the department or the sector that is doing best is the power sector, where there are confirmed policy getting us 87% of the way. But even policy, having a policy and implementing a policy are two different things. And Julius mentioned the kind of coming fight about pylons and so on. It's not, having a policy is part of the way there, but we need more. Big tasks, big gaps on heat and buildings. On transport, there's a high reliance on tech, particularly in aviation, and an absolute unwillingness in any of the major parties to talk about behaviour change, flying less, or whatever. There's just an assumption that jets for sort of shorter flights will become zero carbon because of technology. What happens if they're not? On agriculture, there's a huge gap in the policies that are in place. And agriculture is really important, not only because it's a highly emitting sector, but because it's the sector where we'll need to sequester a lot of greenhouse gases in order to reach net zero. So there's a 72% policy ambition, but 22% of what we need has no policy at all. And there's a real failure to read across from the farming reforms, which are quite visionary and ambitious in principle, to what it actually means in terms of the government's carbon targets and indeed nature targets. Absolute unwillingness to talk about behaviour change, as in eating less meat. And even when the government does sort of things that are necessary for nature, like investing recently £74 million in slurry stores, there was no read across to how to the impact that slurry has on methane emissions. And methane is 30% more intensive than CO2 and is responsible for a lot of global warming, I think 0.5%. And so in all this, there's a failure to read across to detailed policies. And we've talked about the Prime Minister's net zero speech or his rollback on various policies in September, and it was worse in terms of the rhetoric than the reality. But even the reality was pretty bad in terms of scrapping the Energy Efficiency Task Force, scrapping targets to improve the energy efficiency of the most heavily polluting homes, to particularly in the private rented sector, slowing down the phase out of petrol and diesel vehicles. So we reckon that's added a sort of carbon gap of another 6%. So to what needs to come. I will finish there, but all I would say is there is a problem, and it's not going to be resolved before an election, in the opposition parties also having detailed policies. It's all very well to criticise the government, and the government is the government and it's responsible, but it'd be really nice to hear what the opposition parties are going to do on transport, on local government, on agriculture, and so on, in order to close the carbon gap. And we haven't got those details yet.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for keeping very admirably to time, or very close to time. So that gives us plenty of time for discussion and for audience Q&A. So I'm going to start by asking a couple of questions to the panel. And I'll actually start with you, Sean, if that's all right, because I'm going to ask Michael to talk about the Labor Party in a minute to take up your invitation. But I know that Green Alliance works with all parties, and so you have some political intelligence about what's going on in the Conservative Party as well. And I wonder if you could speak to what are some of these underlying political dynamics within the Conservative Party that are both sort of leading to the decisions and some of the rollback that we've discussed, and also potentially resistance to that, right, with other wings of the Conservative Party, and maybe where this might go if the Conservative Party loses government at the next election.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I was at Conservative Party conference. I was at all the party conferences, and it was very interesting because there were sort of two party conferences going on. There was every minister, and including the Prime Minister, kind of had a little bit of a knock at net zero in their speeches, and there was lots on the fringe as well, particularly from the sort of far right, or I shouldn't call them far right, they are kind of far right, Tufton Street think tanks. And there was a sort of whole sort of net zero bashing on the fringe. But there is also still a Conservative Environment Network, which is really the strongest caucus of Conservative MPs, well over 100 MPs, some really quite senior people in it who were a bit appalled. And I kind of thought green conservatism was alive and well, not on the stage, but in the rest of the conference. And green conservatism has been a thing. You can say a thing since Mrs. Thatcher's speeches about climate change in the 80s, but certainly since David Cameron became leader and said vote blue, go green, the Conservatives actually have got quite a good record on many aspects of the environment and are very proud of it and should be, I think, campaigning on it. Rishi Sunak's rollback on net zero targets didn't work, and they lost. They thought that the Uxbridge by-election, which was a by-election fought quite largely on air pollution, on the clean air zone, ultra low emissions zone, was about climate change. It never was, and actually Uxbridge also has never been won by Labour. And then the Conservatives had 2 stonking defeats in by-elections following this strategy, and I think they've rolled back on it. I think the Conservatives now are again sort of saying they're proud of their environmental record. The 2 areas where they are still treating it as a sort of wedge issue are Labour's commitment to the Green Prosperity Plan to investing £28 billion a year in climate action, which is, well, Michael's an economist, I'm not, but it's not going to bust the bank. We borrow a lot already, and there's plenty of evidence that unless we borrow to invest in our creaking infrastructure and competing with the US and other countries that are investing big time in decarbonisation, the economy will carry on struggling. But that's become a sort of wedge issue. And the other wedge issue is over North Sea oil and gas, where the government seems determined to scrape the last barrel out of the North Sea. But other than that, I think the leadership is kind of on track for net zero again. Just two final things. One is there is a problem with Rishi Sunak because he's not interested and doesn't get it, and that percolates down Whitehall. That's what Zach Goldsmith said in his resignation speech from government. But the second problem is there is a big caucus of kind of Looney Tunes, populist, net zero skeptics represented in the Telegraph by Liz Truss, by Jacob Rees-Mogg, GB News, etc., who are really, really gunning for this and are kind of following Trumpian sort of policies. I think what they're also doing is making net zero seem like a technocratic thing which people don't really understand. I heard Jacob Rees-Mogg talking at Conservative Party conference. He didn't mention climate change once. He didn't sort of mention the impact that climate change is clearly having around the world, that we're all experiencing in extreme weather events here. It was all as if this is net zero is a kind of thing imposed by politicians on the people. It's all very well, let's do it a bit more slowly. Why 2050? Let's do it 2070. And I think we need to kind of move away from treating it as a technocratic policy aim and reminding everybody why this stuff matters and why we've got to combat climate change.
Great, thank you. And so, Michael, you previously worked for a former Labor government and follow the Labor Party somewhat closely. I wonder if you could speak to how Labor, as far as you can tell, is thinking about both their policy ambition and some of the politics that we've discussed so far. How's Labor seeing that?
This is a very pertinent question because there is a big argument going on within the top of the Labour Party. It basically means the leader's office. Members don't really count anymore. About how Labour should present its position on net zero and climate change policy. The settled position is pretty clear now, which is that Labour is committed to achieving 28 billion of green spending by the end of a parliament, as long as that fits within the fiscal rules. And as a single statement, that is pretty clear, actually. It is dependent on the fiscal rules. The fiscal rules are a bit nonsensical, as we're just about to discover. They depend on bonkers forecasts of future tax and spend revenues, because it's all about the fiscal rule that constrains the 28 billion investment is that you have to have debt falling by the end of your planning period. And of course, that's just a projection because nobody knows today what's going to be happening at the end of your planning period, 3 or 5 years ahead. And the current Conservative planning period, they can say we're meeting our fiscal rules because they assume massive cuts in public expenditure in their in their planning, which are not going to happen. They're not going to be, even if they got in, they're not going to be able to achieve them. But that's what enables the Chancellor to say, I'm meeting my fiscal rule. And Labour has basically the same fiscal rule in terms of debt falling at the end of their planning period. So it's all nonsense, but insofar as it constrains, depending on what the OBR says your planning, the planning will be, it constrains you, then Labour's 28 billion will be subject to that. But that is reasonably clear. The problem and the discussion that's going on about this is that the Tories now attack this 28 billion as a symbol, not really in its substance, at every possible opportunity. So literally, at any point that they can say Labour is going to borrow, it's not the spending that they focus on, it's the borrowing, is going to borrow an extra 28 billion more. This just shows that they're the same old Labour Party, tax and spend too much, ran out of money last time, Liam Byrne, thank you, and all of that stuff. That's now become a trope of Conservative campaigning, and Labour feels it. Labour, when you say that over and over and over again, you get it repeated back to you in focus groups, and it weakens Labour. And Labour's core strategy for this election is, we're 20 points up, we're not going to blow it. And the way you don't blow it is you don't commit to anything. And that means you can't really be attacked. And this is the one thing that Labour has actually committed to. So if you listen to Yvette Cooper, I mean, just as an exercise in it, listen to Yvette Cooper today on knife crime. She's more Tory than the Tories. Not, quite rightly on knife crime. On immigration, she's more against the small boats than the Conservatives are. There is no gap as far as the public is concerned between what... And that's how you win an election on what the Australians, everybody's advised by Australians, it calls a small target strategy. Present as small a target as you can. It's like a Roman legion getting into a phalanx with their shields all on the outside, as small a target as no chinks. And the 28 billion is the chink in Labour's armour. It's the only thing, really, on which they differ any significance. And there are people at the top of the Labour. The reason there's a debate going on is because they want to close that chink off and basically say we're not committed to it. From what I can tell, and I'm not in those conversations, Keir Starmer is pretty committed to it. I mean, he's gone out of his way in the last week or two to say it's a clear ambition to get to that level within the fiscal spending rule, and we are going to do it, and various other stuff. And then you get bits of briefing from other people. So there's clearly there's an argument on. I'm not particularly bothered about it because this is all about what you say before an election, and there's a massive difference between what you say before an election and what you do afterwards. I don't, from what all I know and I hear, I think Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are completely convinced that we need to get on track to net zero. I'm not actually worried about this. It's an electoral strategy issue. It isn't a policy issue. And I think Labour will get us back on track to net zero. Will want to try. So I'm not bothered about it in that sense. And to be perfectly honest, if we spent 18 billion in the first year and we ramped up to 28 billion in the fourth year, that's 80 billion pounds worth of expenditure. That's quite a lot of money, to be perfectly honest. So these are big sums of money, even if they're not achieved from 28 billion at the beginning. So I'm not so worried about that, and I kind of understand it. I'm a bit more worried about the substance of what we do with that 28 billion, actually, which is very undefined. I mean, part of the reason Rachel Reeves has been able to kind of say we're not going to get there is that it wasn't sufficiently clear-cut what it was going to be spent on. Had Labour said, right, we're going to spend it in these areas, on these projects, then they couldn't have reneged on them because that would have been bits of kit in places and some jobs in parts of the country that needed them. And basically, clearly, she stopped Ed Miliband making those announcements so that she could, keep it under. But anyway, I'm a bit more worried about some of the substance. So, and I wanted to ask you this about Julia. Labour is committed to net zero in the power sector by 2030. We're on the record here. I'm going to say it anyway. I don't think anybody in the power sector thinks that's achievable. And I want to know what you think. That is a massive, massive lift. You can see why Ed wanted a big target, 100%, net zero, 100%. The last 10% is obviously the most difficult. I think we could probably get to 85% by 2030, I think, with a stretch. But we made a 100% commitment, and I think that will be difficult. Now, the interesting question is, does it so drive you guys that even if you don't get there, it's doing the work of driving you, and it forces kind of you there? And then if we fail to get it, well, there'll be a bit of embarrassment in the, in that year, but it's worth it. Or does it look like something where you're basically setting yourself up to fail, and then it's going to become a bit of an albatross? So one thing is that's a very, very tough target. That's a really, really just the amount of kit that we need in the grid. Second thing on this is the big question is not in the power sector, it's in heating, where we are way behind other European countries on heat pumps, and we really need to speed that up, and that is behaviour change. So whereas the electrons you get that power your lights are electrons, it doesn't matter where they come from, your heating system is something you've got in your house, it's your boiler, and we're going to have to switch, and that's a behaviour change. People have got to do that, and as long as they've got a choice, that's an actual decision people want to make, and people are frightened of them. There's been a lot of scaring going on about this, but that's the big issue, and Labour has not yet got a clear policy on this. On the contrary, it's got a policy that rather works against it, which is to insulate 19 million homes by 2030. Now, in the days when Labour did insulation, and we did a lot of insulation, that was the way to make homes more efficient. Now it isn't. We need to get them electrified. Yeah. Electrification is much, much more efficient in total energy used than powering a home by gas and then insulating it. And insulation, we've done the cheap bits. It's a lot more cheap. We could do 2 million more cheap insulation, but the other 17 million are a bit more expensive. Yeah. And the last 2 million, very, very expensive. And actually, Labour is committed to the 19 million homes and probably shouldn't be anymore. It should be committed to electrification. And that's going to be quite a shift and so on. So I won't go, it's going to take too long. Transport, agriculture, not completely sure. The industrial strategy bit's the interesting bit, because Labour is also committed to a stronger industrial strategy, kind of Bidenomics, Securonomics. That's quite a commitment, but it's still very unformed. And unfortunately, you can't just do the Inflation Reduction Act, Bidenomics, in a small country which doesn't make so much anymore. That's a very American thing, and the rest of Europe can do it. We're going to be struggling in that, but this is the big challenge. The big challenge is to make an economic programme out of this, absolutely. And that's the thing.
Great, thank you, Michael. So, Juliet, I'll come to you now, and you feel free to sort of pick up Michael's questions, and mine was going to be sort of similar anyway, which is how does the Energy UK, the trade association, sort of look at the policies from the parties and sort of read the political tea leaves, and presumably also within that at 28 billion that's largely unspecified. I'm sure Energy UK has some ideas about how it could spend that, and maybe you could speak to those as well.
Yeah, no, certainly.
And then we'll open up to audience Q&A, so think of your questions.
Largely I'd probably echo what the others have said. So the Conservative Party have come out and they've said that they're still committed to the net zero target, but I think there's definitely still some areas where, we've seen them rowing back on the policies. They also seem very committed to offshore oil and gas. There's the offshore petroleum licensing bill that's going through right now, and and the IEA has very clearly said that we don't need new oil and gas in the UK. We don't need new, and it doesn't mean you're just turning off the taps as it is, but we don't need to build anything more. And that's currently going through Parliament right now. And actually, it was interesting, your comments on the sort of caucus. I know it was you that were saying about the Conservative Environment Network, and and there's prominent Conservative politicians that are actually very green, and actually seeing a lot of them now. So you will have seen Chris Skidmore resigned recently. He was the author of the Net Zero Review, and actually, once we're seeing those voices within the party drop away, that's going to cause huge issues, I think, for us going forward. And actually, the Net Zero Review itself that Chris Skidmore did, that came out and said that the Net Zero transition is the economic opportunity for this century. So I think there's definitely something around, we're talking about, it's not just around the climate change, and the more that we can kind of push that economic perspective, then the more it kind of floats in with those parties. When it comes to Labour, 2030 power sector target, is it achievable? I don't know. All I will say is we've seen technology, the growth of the offshore wind sector, nobody thought it would grow that quickly, and that was largely down to innovation as well as the supportive policies, and that just meant that it was able to grow at a rate that no one ever anticipated. So you never know what technology might bring. For us, we obviously want to see a net zero power system as soon as we possibly can, but what's really important is that we don't rush it in a way that distorts the market that's already investing here, and we don't have those unintended consequences that might come from shifting a bit of policy here that then may have an impact on the retail sector here. Sometimes if you do something on the generation side, it can inadvertently cause, cause increases in bills and things like that. So it needs to be taken as a sort of holistic system approach. Again, with Labour, so that Labour have announced GB Energy, which would be a nationalised energy company as such. But again, there's very little detail behind it. And so at the minute, it's kind of everything and nothing to everyone all at once, because nobody really knows what it is. So it's quite hard to comment as much on that. And again, I think the industry doesn't have an issue with having a nationalised energy party. As long as the playing field remains fair and competitive, then I think we can see that working. But as I said in my sort of opening remarks, I think with all of it, it is really about the private sector and making sure that they can continue to invest, because they will be the ones delivering most of this capital to get to net zero. And if you think about the 28 billion from Labour, what they should really be articulating is the multiplier effect. So, actually you make this investment, but then there's this huge, multiplier effect that comes from that. So if you take the Inflation Reduction Act in the States, they've announced, is it $500 billion of public sector money, and that in turn has delivered $3 trillion, so 6 times more. So for every $1 of public spending, they've attracted $6 in private finance. So that's what Labour should be communicating, actually, is that if you can kickstart it and kickstart industries, then actually then you get the supply chain, then you get the investment, and then the private sector can deliver it. And so I think, that's on policies.
Fantastic. All right. Well, now over to audience Q&A. I'll take them in groups of 3, and I'm going to hand over the mic to Eleanor, who's going to collect the questions. So hands up, please. Okay, we've got 2 up the back there, so let's take those 2 first. And please say your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Defna. I'm a law student, and I was particularly intrigued by the point about increasing investor confidence and security in what's actually happening. And I was wondering if you think the emerging climate change or climate-related disclosure regimes are actually helping that. So in terms of the ISSB, SRS, everything kind of that's going on internationally, do you think that's actually going to have an effect? And more broadly, how do you think, to all of the panel, the legal system can kind of help with this transition, and how we can be more effective going beyond just the politics and policy, but more on a kind of case-to-case basis?
Hi, my name is Dermot Barnes. I'm I'm an alumnus of UCL and also work in the sector. My question really is around the pricing and politics of all of this. So if we focus on what Julia was saying about establishing a secure investment framework, does the panel think that energy prices, which are already considered to be so high as to induce all this fuel poverty, can be played with? Because ultimately this has to be paid for. The investment returns for the private sector, given that we're not going to nationalize the energy industry, I don't think. Who is going to pay for this, or how is it going to be priced? Is it going to, tax bills somewhere or energy bills somewhere? And what is the best way of making this palatable and translating that into appetite for decarbonisation with consumers who can see a benefit almost in decarbonisation? Ultimately, how can we make the savings that come from renewable energy visible to consumers so that they back it and want to do it?
Great, and I'll take one more. Is there another question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Cecilia. First, I would like to thank. It was very interesting and informative. And second, I would like to ask for all of you, what do you believe is the role of bioenergy in the UK? Thank you.
Great. So feel free to just take one or more of those. Don't all answer each, but I think probably any of you could answer any of those. So who would like to start?
I'm happy to start. Yeah, so I think in terms of the who pays and the pricing and the policy, so already there are some bits that are going on energy bills, so some of the policy costs that we see. So that might include some of the bits like the contributions for the contracts for difference. So when the wind farms are getting topped up, could include things like energy efficiency schemes to help vulnerable people. So they're currently on energy bills. We actually argue that they should be moved to general taxation because it's a much less regressive way of doing it, and it seems fairer on everyone. And I think, I spoke a lot about the kind of infrastructure and generation side in my opening remarks, but actually the people side of this is so huge, and we need to make it as easy as possible for people to make the right choices that are right for them. It won't be the same thing, the same solution won't be right for everyone, and we need to make sure that the vulnerable are well supported and that everybody can afford their energy bills. We've mentioned Rishi Sunak's speech numerous times on the minimum energy efficiency standards for landlords, which they weren't rowed back on because they weren't introduced, but he was supposed to introduce them at that point and he didn't. And actually, when you think that 1 in 4 properties in the private rented sector is living in fuel poverty, and there's now no incentive for landlords to improve the energy efficiency of those homes, which would immediately lower their energy bills. So, and then in terms of the wider point of who pays, like I've said, actually a lot of the investment to get there will come from the private sector, as long as we can make that environment right so that they want to invest here in the UK. And right now, with the global competition increasing, with the Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to miss a huge window of opportunity where actually those firms are thinking right now, where should I build my headquarters? And it's way more attractive to do it in the States than it is here, and we've lost that stable positioning that we had. And I've forgotten the rest of the questions. So there we go. I will stop there and hand over to someone else.
One on bioenergy, maybe? Does Energy UK represent bioenergy companies?
I don't have that much to do with bioenergy, to be honest. Yeah, I don't know much about it. I'm sorry, I probably should, and I don't. So I will take that away as a commitment and action that I will go and look into it. Thank you.
Who else would like to come in?
Can I just come in on costs? Because there are there's in the end who pays is we will pay, the public will pay, because that's how capitalism works. But then the question is it through bills or is it through taxes? And basically all Labour as well as Conservative governments have placed most of those policy costs on consumers. Basically, the energy companies have been told to do things, and then they've been allowed to raise their prices in order to cover the cost. So energy efficiency measures, for example, all the insulation that Labour did, we all paid for it. I mean, it mainly went to fuel poor people and people in social housing. So that was quite redistributive in a sense, because every consumer paid. But those costs are now rising, and they're not as big as is sometimes claimed, but they will get bigger. And I think there is now quite a strong case, as Juliet has said, to put at least some of those on taxpayers, because tax is a more progressive system than bill. I mean, basically tax is just about as progressive if it's income tax, whereas bills is regressive. So I think there is a possibility to shift some of those subsidy costs and policy costs onto taxpayers. The other interesting thing there is about the cost of capital, which Julia's mentioned, and there we have 3 different kinds of company. We will have 3 different kinds of companies under a Labour government in the energy field. There will be the private sector companies who raise money partly through external raising, but partly internally, and pay market rates of capital in competitive markets. The second kind of company we have are the district network operators who operate the last bit of the energy system, the power system and gas, it brings it into your home from the main companies in Energy UK, and they are completely regulated. They are uncompetitive, and their pricing is regulated by the state, and they can only limit. They have very, very low cost of capital because basically they're not under any competitive pressure. And then we're going to have Great British Energy, which is going to be a publicly owned company, which will presumably issue bonds in the market, but may also get money from government. And one would imagine if it doesn't need to make the profits that the private sector needs to make, because it won't have shareholders, may be able to keep its costs a bit low. That's kind of part of the point. So the question is, who's going to do the work? Because basically, who's going to do the investment? Oh, and then you've got the other people, is consumers. The very, very last people on whose balance sheets we should be playing this stuff are consumers. We've tried doing that with energy efficiency measures. The Green Deal was the coalition government's attempt to get consumers to borrow money to insulate their homes or put in heat pumps. And it was a complete failure because the cost of capital was 7%. And basically you're asking people, householders, to borrow at 7% and use up their hard-earned savings on some insulation rather than a holiday at 7%. And they would get the money back in 8 to 10 years. I mean, that's just it's not a proposition, and nobody did it. The very last people we should be getting to do this, pay the capital costs, are consumers, because they have the highest cost of capital, much the most expensive. We borrow at much higher rates than that, and we have much the most scarce capital. So if we've got a bit of money to spare, we're going to spend it on a holiday or on giving our children a deposit or whatever. So that's the range of possibilities. I would like to see more put on the DNOs. You can tell where this is going, on the district network operators, because they have the lowest cost.
Support that, absolutely.
They have the lowest cost of capital. They are attached to every home, so that when you move, because part of the problem with these things is if you move, your capital is left behind in your home. If you invest in a heat pump and you haven't paid it off through the savings you get, when you move, the next people will gain the benefit of that in theory, and college says, oh, it'll be reflected in the price of your house. Bugger that, it won't. So put it on the regulated asset base, cheapest cost of capital attached to the home, and basically that heat pump should not belong to the householder, in my view. It should belong to the DNO, who's always attached to the house, and they should then charge the homeowner and get their money back on. They could be amortised over 15 years, easily, low cost of capital. The consumer gets a bit of benefit because it's cheaper, doesn't pay any capital cost up front. Now, it's very interesting you're agreeing with this, because many of the energy companies don't agree with this, because they want to build competitive markets in providing heat pumps. So this is a very interesting question of who should be doing this stuff, on whose balance sheet should be, and we need to look at the cost of capital, because we want the cost of capital to be as low as possible. So I think there are some very innovative ways that we could think about organising all this investment so that it doesn't fall on consumers, on their balance sheets and on their bills, because that will be the way to slow it down. If not, to not have it at all, because it won't get implemented.
Great, thanks, Sean. You can speak to any of them, but perhaps also, could you have something to say about the first question about disclosure regimes and their impact?
Yeah, but I'm just on the question, the second question. The obvious thing to say is I wouldn't start from here as well, because what we're paying for is the kind of getting rid of the green crap a few years ago, and if we had invested before in cheaper renewable energy, etc., we wouldn't be suffering high gas prices now, as some continental countries are. But anyway, on the climate...
Getting rid of the green crap was, of course, a David Cameron phrase for those who don't know. It's not Sean's view about...
But the point that Sean's making is absolutely critical. Had we invested in insulation and in other measures over the last 10 years, more than we did, and we got rid of a lot of that, we would be paying lower energy bills.
Yeah.
By
9.8 billion.
Well, how much is it?
9.8 billion the green crap cost.
Since 2015.
And you can see as well, the sort of graph kind of on the insulation,
it's
where
going
it's
up
just
and then
like,
it went,
woo, and then like, insulation I think dropped 97% or something.
Yeah. But also the ban on onshore wind, which is a cheaper form of generation, etc. So on climate disclosure, I'm certainly not an expert on this. My sense is it has been positive, does make a difference. It certainly makes a difference with the companies that want to do it. A lot of it's voluntary, so there are sort of laggards behind. But when I talk to big businesses, most of them are really bought in to the green transition. That's where the investment's going. They're committed in the boardroom to it. They're ahead of the politicians on it. And they say that even if the government did a pivot against green policies, they would carry on investing, because that's where they see their future. And the more transparency you can bring to that, I think the better. And I think it's also particularly useful on the nature side as well, where there's now more disclosure on nature as well, and because nature has been the sort of poor relation, nature policy has been the poor relation to climate policy, and we do need to restore our natural ecosystems as well. On bioenergy, I mean, Green Alliance is a bit sceptical, I have to say. We're really sceptical about DRACs, about importing kind of vast quantities of wood pellets from North America to feed our energy. We're sceptical about biofuels. I think there was a big debate after the Russian invasion of Ukraine about could we afford policies that were going to return some farmland to nature, to plant trees, to restore peat, absolutely essential if we're going to achieve net zero. And there was a sort of nature versus food frame that was being produced by some climate skeptics. But at the same time, we're producing biofuels, which is obviously not food, and there are greener alternatives to biofuels, and also biofuels tend to be really, really bad for nature as well. They're sort of monocultural, ecological wastelands. But you might have a different point of view.
Sorry. I don't think the microphone's going to pick you up, but no, the microphone won't hear you. So if you have a very, very quick follow-up, we can give you the microphone, but and then I'll take another round of questions. Just very quickly.
Sorry, but just with the biomass strategy that was released last year by the government, do you believe
By
biomass strategy?
Yeah. I'm not an expert on it, so I'm going to have to pass on that.
Okay, thank you.
So next round of questions. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Two very quick questions. I'm Claire Collum. I'm Professor of Planning, formerly here at UCL and now in Cambridge. So you mentioned planning as being the bad villain in the room, preventing all sorts of developments from happening. And certainly it's under attack also for the housing crisis, everything that's wrong. And we have Sean, who's in his previous life has probably dealt with planning a lot. So my question is, how could we improve or reform the planning system to facilitate some of the things whilst keeping a degree of local democracy and debate about the environmental landscape consequences of, the pylons and the wind farms. And my other question is very different. How can we counter the playbook of the far right that you've mentioned in turning some of these issues into part of the culture wars? And this is happening all over Europe. Like literally today, the French newspapers were titling how the farmers' protests that are happening right now are being mobilized by the far right exactly along the lines that you described, saying it's all the fault of these woke metropolitan imposing environment regulations on you. So it seems to be spreading like fire as a strategy. And how can the narrative be changed on the progressive side to recapture the voters that might be tempted?
Another question? Alan?
Thank you very much. Alan Rennick from the UCL Department of Political Science, UCL Constitution Unit. This has been really fascinating. Thank you so much. Really great conversation. My question actually relates to the second question there. So what I heard above all from all three of you was that not enough attention is being paid to public opinion and carrying public opinion along, and that is going to get harder and harder over the coming years. And to me, it's a no-brainer that we should be thinking about how to stimulate more thoughtful public conversation around this. And things like citizens' assemblies are potentially very useful for that. And alas, Extinction Rebellion has slightly terrified politicians with the idea that citizens' assemblies are going to replace Parliament and that kind of thing. So politicians seem to be quite scared of this. But do you think there's any prospect for a Labour government, for example, to move in that direction?
Great. And I saw, was there a question there? Yep.
Thank you again for the great discussion. And I have, I think, two questions. So first one is, what do you think are the main drivers of the clean energy transition? Specifically also the coal phasing out on the country basis. So is it the government policy? Is it the private investment, or a particular kind of installation imposed by the country or any kind of specific sector? And the second one, what do you think is in general the progression and the role in the future of the sustainable finance? Thank you.
Okay, so we essentially have 5 questions there, and we have about 8 minutes because we have a hard stop at 7:30. So I'm going to maybe start with Sean, and then Juliet, and then Michael, and sort of you make this your last comment. Sean.
Yeah, I was really pleased, keen to go first, so I don't reveal that I haven't read something like the biomass strategy again, getting the last question. So, I love planning. I really, because I do. It's really strange, but I think we are going to need to plan properly for major landscape changes. Juliet talked about the kind of how much more grid we're going to have in the next 5 years than the previous 30. But I think you need to have confidence about planning. You need to change the rhetoric. Keir Starmer talking about bulldozing planning is really unhelpful. It's the same language that Eric Pickles was using, the Conservative minister in 2010, when he talked about planning being the last outpost of Albanian communism and that sort of thing. And what we need is an active planning system to get public consent for the major landscape changes and the housing that we need. And a lot of it set out in the Windsor Review about how to change the network. We need a spatial plan. We need government to update the national planning statements more regularly and not sort of hide behind inertia and say it's all the fault of planning when they haven't done their part of the bargain. But it is going to be difficult, and there will be quite big landscape changes, and we need to get the whole question of community benefit right, how you compensate communities for disruption without it introducing a kind of element of bribery into the planning system, which is the danger. On the whole culture war thing, if I had the answer, well, I wish I had the answer. I think it's going to be really, really difficult. And what we know from the United States, I don't want to sound like a paranoid lefty, and Green Alliance is above politics, so I'm not that. But we know that the Trumpian populists are really, really effective at shifting the argument, talking about sort of death taxes instead of inheritance taxes and so on. And we're seeing it now in the net zero debate. The debate about Port Talbot, terrible, 3,000 jobs going. And it's being blamed on net zero. But the world is moving towards cleaner steel. There's been no planning. There's been no negotiations with the unions and the government and the communities. It was a sort of accident waiting to happen, but it's absolutely now being pinned on unaffordable net zero policies. I saw the video that Richard Tice from Reform UK did on it, and it's like he's rubbing his hands because he can blame this sort of terrible hammer blow to communities in Wales on net zero, and we're going to get more and more of that. And so we do need to fight back, but there's an awful lot of money going into shifting the argument, and you're seeing it on social media, seeing it on GB News, etc. So it's going to be a tough fight.
Juliet.
Going very quickly on planning and then a bit on the common side of things. So on planning, on the large-scale projects, it's really about making it less onerous, but exactly as you say, not cutting any corners when it comes to environmental assessments or anything like that. It's just the actual process takes a lot of time, and because there's a lot of projects coming through, you need to make sure those institutions are really well resourced with experts. Otherwise, it is just not having enough people to process them. I think the last 6 large-scale offshore wind farms were actually rejected by the planning inspectorate and had to go to the Secretary of State for approval. You shouldn't have to be doing that every single time. Onshore wind, Ukraine built more onshore wind in the last 12 months than England did, which that's ridiculous. Why? Because you just need one person to stop an onshore wind project in the UK, and that's it. And again, so simple, non-fiscal changes actually that government can make to the planning system, and I think that's why it's a no-brainer, because it's not costing them any money to change this. It's just making it easier. And then on a very, very local level, you've got things like, heat pumps, EV charging. How are we connecting those to the grid? Are we making it easy for people? Do they know where to go? That sort of thing. So, I think there's a lot there.
But also not blaming everything on planning. It's skills, it's supply chains, there's a whole lot of other stuff.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, sorry.
I said I love planning.
No. And then on the far right, and I think they're really good at comms, and it's really hard to fight that. The social media asset that you mentioned, where they listed, they listed 6 things that they had that weren't true, and at the bottom, and they said, and we're stopping expensive insulation. The amount of people in my bubble that were sharing that image, saying this is ridiculous, look at this is all crap. Actually, what they were doing was sharing that message even more. So it's interesting, actually, the yeah, and like you, I don't know how to combat it. Otherwise, we would be. But I think fighting things with facts and evidence as much as we can, so that we're rebutting it. You know, rebutting media things that are wrong. And providing the facts. And also, as I said, going more on that economic argument for people, making it easy as possible for them, and to make the right choices for them.
And Michael, so maybe something on citizens' assemblies and involving the public, and sort of government versus capital in driving the government versus
coal phase out. And I mean, it's a very specific. It's not really a UK issue because we've done all of our coal phase out. We've actually had the first year in 250 years where no coal was burnt on the, or no, not the day, a day I think it was, or a week. It wasn't the whole year. Yeah. But we've had moments when we've had no coal burnt on the system since, literally for 250 years. That's what we do. However, in many parts of the world, coal phase out is very difficult, but there are countries that are now committing to it, even with all that difficulty. So South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, committing to coal phase out when they are very dependent on coal. And in South Africa, there are 82,000 coal miners. So this is an incredibly challenging thing, and it makes a huge difference whether your coal-fired power stations are old or new. So South Africa has very old ones, so there is at least a financial case for getting rid of them because they're inefficient, they've been paid off already. Indonesia has lots of newish ones, so that's really difficult because the capital is still being paid for. So this is a fantastic challenge in the rest of the world, and we should never lecture other countries from the comfort of a system which basically did it for economic reasons and never really had to, and of course destroyed our coal industry and our coal mining communities with terrible costs and so on. It's one of the biggest challenges in the world. And sustainable finance is part of the answer because gradually the finance sector is being pushed into acknowledging the risks in its climate, in its high emissions investments, paying more attention to its greener investments. And so the field of sustainable finance is beginning, not enough yet. A lot of coal is still paid for in the City of London, is invested in the City of London. City of London, we don't use coal anymore, but the City of London still finances it all around the world. But it's beginning to have an impact, the sustainable finance agenda, but too slowly. On the planning side and on the culture wars side, fortunately, in the UK, we don't have lots of small farmers. Small farmers are under massive pressure, a little bit from environmental regulation, but mostly under the pressure of a global food system. And they are expressing their grievances. And in the Netherlands and in Germany, and we have a very large farm sector, and they are more bought into the net zero agenda and so on. So we're unlikely to see that kind of rural opposition around net zero, but largely for kind of economic plus cultural reasons. But that is very potent in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany. And what the right do is they whip up grievance, and then they blame it on things that are not really the cause, but which you can create this. And they have the great advantage of they don't need to be true. Mm. Whereas the rest of us kind of think our messaging ought to be broadly true. But I play football, I'm a striker, and I used to think defenders have it easy. They can get the ball anywhere other than in the goal, and they've succeeded. I have to get it in the goal. And I feel like this is for progressives. We have to say things that are true. The right can say absolutely anything in order to mobilise those grievances. And that's obviously what they do, and they do it very effectively. We are hamstrung by that kind of commitment to... And we also have to have policies that we think we're going to work, because we want to do them. Richard Tice has no interest in saying anything that might actually work.
No, of course not.
So this is a kind of big handicap. My regret on public opinion is that we're not talking about climate change enough. The vast majority of the British public are really worried about climate change. Yeah. They can see what's happening in the weather. They can see the science. We have reasonably good media. And they know that their children are going to inherit it. And their children are not a future generation. We used to talk about future generations. It's not the future generation. These are current generations. These are absolutely current generations. Actually, it's quite a lot of years. Are going to live in a world that will be really, really tough. And I think we need to talk more about climate change. The thing that the political consensus did, we got complacent, I think, about how much we needed to talk to the public. We did a lot of climate policy without a lot of talking to the public, because we had consensus in Parliament, and we're going to need to talk to the Parliament, to the public more. And I hope we talk about climate change, and we say the reason what this net zero thing is. This is about making a world that's livable for your children who are currently in their teens and in their 20s and 30s. And don't you want to do that? And of course the answer is yes. So I think we should be talking more about climate change. Citizen assemblies, great idea. The problem is only a small number of people take part in them. The people who do take part in them are completely convinced, but the people who don't know. We need to talk about the results of those kind of things more. But I do hope Labour will kind of go on the offensive about how important climate policy is. And if it doesn't, then I think it will lose. Because I think it's so easy to whip up the grievances on the right that we need to be very proactively in favour of this stuff.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Before we collectively thank our speakers, let me just remind you about our next policy and practice event. So we'll be taking a break next Thursday to make way for our colleague Philip Ayoub's professorial inaugural lecture on LGBT rights revolutions and the moral conservative oppositions. Different kind of conservative oppositions, but similar ideas. But our next policy and practice event will be the following week, Thursday the 8th of February. So join us for a panel on data-driven campaigning. How and why do political parties do it? You can sign up for it via our website and Eventbrite. If you don't already, please follow us on Twitter or Instagram. Our handle is UCLSPP. We announce all of our forthcoming events here, and you'll be able to keep up to date with our latest research. So, final thing, please join me in thanking our speakers for a wonderful and insightful panel. Thank you very much.